Our topic this week is challenges that we encounter as we use controversial materials in our classroom. A lot of times, controversy results in some kind of challenge or censorship of the materials that we want to use. So we need to think about why we even need to care about this topic. The first thing we need to consider is what would be a good definition of censorship. We talk a lot about it, but what does it really mean? And as we think about that, we need to think about the statements that are here. What gets challenged and who does the challenging? What who makes the response to a challenge? What is our political climate and how does that fit into challenges today? What trade books are available to students and what are good trade books to use with any one particular topic. So we have to think about those things as we think about this idea of controversial topics in the classroom. Galda and her colleagues talk about two things. They talk about censorship and they talk about selection. And we may look at this in terms of semantics. Are these two definitions actually saying the same thing? So, for instance, censorship, they say, is the attempt to deny others the right to read something the censor thinks is offensive. Selection, they say, is the process of choosing appropriate material for readers according to literary and educational judgments. So you have to consider, is there a problem in viewing censorship as a whole in this way? The National Council of Teachers of English kind of further elaborates on this. They say that censorship excludes specific materials, but selection includes, meaning that censorship seeks to get rid of something. Selection says, let's pick what is developmentally and educationally appropriate for the students that we have. And granted, there are books and materials that deal with topics that we wouldn't teach to second graders, for instance, that we might feel would be appropriate to teach to middle schoolers or to high schoolers. So we have to think about developmental readiness as well when we think about issues of controversy. Censorship, they say, is negative and selection is affirmative. Censorship intends to control the reading of others because people who want to impose censorship want to impose their opinion on other people. Selection intends to advise the reading of others. In their viewpoint, selection would say, okay, here's the material that we consider offensive or controversial, and we just want to point it out to you. We want you to know it so that you can make your own decision. They say that censorship seeks to indoctrinate and limit access to ideas, while selection seeks to educate and increase access to ideas. And then finally, censorship looks at pieces and parts of the work in isolation rather than in whole. That selection looks at the relationship of those parts to each other and to the work as a whole. One of the things that we have to consider when we're thinking about controversial materials in the classroom is the outside influences that impact those decisions. And this is a list of some of those outside influences. Lifestyle choices. When we think about a classroom full of children, 30 children, 35 children, you're going to have many different lifestyle choices in that classroom. Even at sixth grade, there are students who are beginning to either make their own decisions about lifestyle choices, or they are a part of lifestyle choices that their families have made. So we have to consider that. We have to consider family configurations. In the students in your classroom, you're going to have students who are being raised by two parents. You're going to have students being raised by a single parent, either a father or a mother. You're going to have students who might be raised by two moms or two dads. You might have students who are being raised by more than two moms or two dads. I read a thing just this past weekend about a family that the parents decided to divorce and both parents remarried, and then they determined that they really wanted to do what was best for their children, and they wanted to co-parent. So both couples co-parent their children. In fact, to the point that both couples live in the same home. The house is a big house, and both sets of parents live in the home and co-parent their children. You might have students who are being parented by grandparents, by aunts or uncles, by older brothers or sisters. You might have children who are well on their way to emancipating themselves from their families and living alone, depending on age of students in your classroom, particularly if you're teaching eighth graders who might already be 16, 17 years old. You have to think about political beliefs of the families in your community and of the community itself. What is considered appropriate language usage in the area and what is not considered appropriate language usage. One of the things that most people don't think about when they think about controversy is body image, which has become more and more important and more in the news lately. And how students who are beginning to learn about their bodies and learn about what is considered socially acceptable in their community feel about themselves. Addictions to drugs or to alcohol and violence. So all of these are issues that impact controversy and controversial topics in our classroom, and we have to think about how we can address these things if we choose to use those materials. Many teachers will say, well, I'm just not going to use anything that is controversial because I don't want to get into trouble. That's not always the best solution, because what you're doing automatically is some form of control over what you're using in your classroom. So you have to think, but you also have to consider what you are comfortable with. A lot of these issues we have very strong opinions about as teachers. And so you have to consider how you feel about that particular situation. We have to think about community standards. What might be perfectly acceptable in one community may not be as acceptable in another community. For instance, if it's the middle of a big city, there's going to be more diversity and a lot more difference in the way that people feel about things than there might be in a rural community of a small town. So you have to think about the community standards that are around. Your educational objectives, what they might be. We're teaching middle schoolers, and part of the issue with teaching middle schoolers is their beginning awareness of their own bodies, their own selves, and there are some topics that perhaps need to be addressed in the classroom to make sure that our students have a well-rounded understanding of themselves and their place in society. But there would be some people who might say, no, that shouldn't happen in a middle school classroom. And then the needs of the student. Do we have students that are going through issues that are controversial issues that might be addressed in some of the literature or some of the materials and resources that we use in the classroom? Think about bibliotherapy and that idea of being able to hand a book to a child that is experiencing the same problem as the main character in the book, and the main character figures out a way to cope. Can we help a child figure out a way to cope in sort of a non-threatening way by giving them a book to read that they could then model or pattern themselves from? So I put a list on this week's module of the 100 top challenged children's books in the United States and the reasons that they're challenged. So I want you to go out and look at those and consider the reasons. There are many, many, many reasons. And some of them we've already talked about in this PowerPoint for the challenges that have taken place related to these books, many of which you might have the opportunity to have on your bookshelf in your classroom or to use in a text set for instance, as well. And think about what you can infer from the reasons that these books were challenged and how that links to what we've just talked about in this PowerPoint. If materials are considered controversial, there is a process that has to be gone through to address the issue. So the first thing is that someone makes a decision that they want to challenge the material or the book. Formal paperwork has to be filed with the school. There are forms that are created by districts that have to be filed in order for a book to be, or any material to be considered. And then a committee is formed in the school, so it usually is composed of an administrator, perhaps guidance counselor, or maybe a school psychologist. Sometimes parents are invited to be on that committee. Students might be invited to be on that committee. Teachers might be invited to be on that committee. And the committee then investigates the complaint. Theoretically, they're supposed to have read the material. That may or may not have happened. They may or may not have read completely through the material and really thought about what is in there. They may have only skimmed through the material, and they're making a sort of unjustified decision about the material that they're looking at. So the committee is tasked with making a decision about what to do about the challenge. So it can be one of three things. It can be restrict the material so that you have to have parent approval as a child to be able to read that material. Remove the material completely, take it completely off the table and out of the classroom and not allow the students to have access to it. Or to allow the material to be in unrestricted access, which means that anybody could continue to use it. And with a lot of those books on that list of 100 challenge materials, that has happened. The issue with that list is that those are books that have been repeatedly challenged across the nation in some cases. So the first challenge was considered, let's put it back on unrestricted access. And then it was challenged again. So, the committee has to make a decision. If the committee doesn't own up to it and decides not to make a decision, they then pass the decision up the chain to the district people, district personnel, which the same process has gone through, only the committee then usually includes community members, perhaps clergy from the community, parents, district personnel, those kinds of things. And they go through that same process, and they also may not read the book. In fact, that usually happens more often at that level because they have less time. They skim through the book and they make decisions, one of those three decisions based on just that skimming through. And then at that point, the teacher is notified of the response to the challenge and has to make plans one way or the other, either to continue to use it or not continue to use the material. So what should teachers do? Every year, the media specialist in the school receives a list from the district that lists books that have been challenged and or banned from use in the district. So check with the media specialist to see what books are on that list and see if any of the books that you intend to use or any of the materials that you intend to use in your text set, for instance, would be on that list. Always operate in the sunshine. Make sure parents know about the materials and the textbooks in your and books in your classroom and give them the opportunity to look at them. Offer a lot of diversity in your books for your students because students need to see themselves in what they read. Know those books so that you can recommend books to students or choose a different book if there's a challenge. And then decide what issues are important to you. For some people, that issue of controversy is something they want to avoid entirely. So when you're thinking about your text set, look at your resources. Is there any controversy that you might need to address up front? It's always better to address things up front first. Give students plenty of time to think about the issue and process how they feel about that issue before they begin to discuss that issue. Make sure that respect is a part of your instruction. We teach children to respect the opinions of others and always stress open-mindedness. I can listen to your side of the story. I don't necessarily have to agree with you, but I can listen in an open-minded way. So think about all these as you're thinking about your text set. And your task for this week is to go back and look at your topic, look at your text set, and decide what's there and what you need to do, if anything, to address any issues that might arise from the material that you're using. Good luck.